For Project Catalyst, that work said, focusing on the next decade, which is what I said I would focus on, energy efficiency steps, if fully exploited. Very hard to do, okay? But if fully exploited, and I believe the model I've suggested can contribute in big ways to actually getting the job done, but if fully exploited, the energy efficiency opportunity would provide about 1/3 of what Project Catalyst, working with McKinsey, believes needs to be done over this next decade. So 1/3 of what needs to be done to improve relative to the IPCC business as usual case, our position in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Huge undertaking, energy efficiency, 1/3 over the next decade. Much of that, the least cost means that are available at all. But then second, also in the least cost category, is preserving tropical forests and soils. And here's a striking fact, and I don't want to say this without saying this is yet more daunting than the energy efficiency capture. It's yet more difficult. But by this calculus looking, Dr. Kreutz may address this at all, or I would invite him to, looking at the range of things that can be done to mitigate climate change in this first decade while we're building further capabilities in, for example, renewables. Forestry offers nearly 50% of the least cost opportunities. So yet more than energy efficiency. Now that's a theoretical 50% or 47, 48% is really the number in one sense, and that is it's just virtually impossible to get all that done. But this analysis tells us that's something we've got to focus on. And so what do we need to do to get the job done? And it's incredibly difficult. Most of these, substantially all these forests are in poor countries. They lie in the equatorial band around the globe. They're in Africa, they're in Asia, they're in Latin America. The reason the forests are in danger is people who live in those countries, indigenous peoples, are very poor people who are looking desperately to means to achieve some level of economic livelihood. That's entirely understandable, of course, even admirable. But the effects on the world in terms of climate change effects are dire. They're disastrous. The economic, the environmental effects are really, really harsh. So when you think about dealing with climate change, it seems to me one of the most important things to think about is scale. What's really going to make a difference? And this one would really make a difference. So we have to come together, this kind of frustrating meetings that you all have. We have to come together and say this is a target worth putting right at the top of the list and figuring out how to do something about it. And the kinds of things that have to be done, and this I'm no expert in. The other I really, I've done it all. This I'm no expert on, but the more I read, the more I care. And what we've got to do is find ways to map out the affected lands, to develop plans for addressing them, find economic models in which the people who are driven to do these things to try to raise the livelihood of their families, find alternative means, training of peoples to maybe help support in this, development of law enforcement regimes, development of strong governance practices. All those things have to be done. And of course, all those things require, among other things, very, very substantial financial investments. And those financial investments, as a practical matter, will need to come from the wealthier nations and peoples of the world. And that seems to me right and proper and the thing that needs to be done. And I don't have any great expertise. Many of you will have more expertise about the challenges that these great international aid agencies, like the World Bank, like the United Nations Development Program, others in raising the funds. I'm not an expert on that at all. So I'm not going to address that all. It simply has to happen, and we have to raise the awareness and the understanding and provide the support to make it happen. But what I want to call to your attention now is something that is really quite striking to me that I think has been touched on relatively little. And that is those of us who care a lot, and I think everybody here cares, about U.S. federal climate change legislation, are struck with the fact that the legislation, the so-called Waxman-Markey bill that has passed the House of Representatives, has an unexpectedly high level of international offset opportunities set out. So most of you will know, I think, what that is, but in a cap-and-trade program, a possibility that's set up, for example, under this legislation, is that companies like mine, private sector actors, could invest in developing countries and achieve offsets, meaning as an alternative to having the allowances that they might trade domestically, they can be awarded effectively allowances for their greenhouse gas emissions. And these are large numbers in the Waxman-Markey bill. And they come in a number of forms, and I won't go through all the numbers right now, but you can easily imagine something like, on an annualized basis, 1.5 billion gigatons. So huge numbers on an annualized basis. There's also in the legislation provision that domestic allowances can be sold at auction to raise what looks like another 700 million gigatons of value for investment in developing countries. And of course, one of the great opportunities, the prioritized opportunity I here believe should be in working with these forestry and soil protections in these developing countries. So that's a supplement to the funds that can be raised by international agencies. And when you put what can be raised there together with what might be done under these offsets, I think your hopes brighten that something might be done with a really concerted effort. I'll close, and I think I won't talk any further. I won't reach electric transportation. But dealing with offsets is hard. Getting fair values, getting a transparency, ensuring that offsets are provided only for incremental steps, assuring that offsets are provided only where the investment made endures for a reasonable lifespan, all those things have to be